Good day. Today is Friday, 29th August 2025. And before I return to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine, I'm going to turn briefly to the situation in the Middle East, because there's been some concerning news about the stance of the Western powers towards Iran. An event has taken place which further reinforces my belief that we're going to see a renewed conflict between Iran and Israel fairly soon. Briefly, yesterday, the three Western powers, Britain, France, and Germany, announced that they considered Iran to be in non-compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of 2015. And on that basis, they're claiming that the sanctions which the Security Council, the UN Security Council, had imposed on Iran more than 2 decades ago, and which were partially lifted as a result of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that those sanctions should be, as they say, snapped back. In other words, they should be brought back into force. Supposedly, this is due to happen within 30 days, perhaps at a future Security Council meeting, which will be actually held after that 30-day period has passed, sometime in October. And apparently there's been some diplomatic activity, some diplomatic contacts. The British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has been in discussions, has had conversations with the Iranian Foreign Minister Arakchi. And the grounds given for the decision to declare Iran in violation of its obligations under the JCPOA, and thus to facilitate this sanctions snapback, is Iran's refusal to allow the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, to again start examining its nuclear sites. Well, what has actually happened is that, as I discussed in recent programs, the Iranians did have a meeting with the IAEA. They made it very clear that after the events of the 12-day war, where the Iranians feel that the IAEA and its chief, Rafael Grossi, behaved very improperly, providing information to the United States and Israel, which facilitated the American and Israeli attacks on the Iranian nuclear sites, nuclear enrichment sites, and possibly also identifying Iranian scientists involved in the program, the enrichment program. Quite apart from that, the Iranians were also furious about the failure of the IAEA to straightforwardly condemn attacks on what the Iranians insist were peaceful nuclear facilities in violation of the provisions of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Anyway, there was a meeting between the IAEA and Iran, and the Iranians reiterated their refusal to allow the IAEA access to the relevant nuclear sites, though they did allow the IAEA access to the nuclear power plant in Bushehr, which I think it is widely accepted is indeed a civilian program, one developed by Iran in cooperation with the Russians. So this apparently was what happened. There was a meeting and the IAEA went away dissatisfied. The European powers have made major efforts to get Iran to readmit the IAEA to the other nuclear sites, to Fordow and Natanz and other places, and the Iranians said no. And the result is that the three European powers, as I said, are now saying that Iran is in breach of its obligations under the JCPOA. Now, the Iranians, for their part, are saying that the European powers are themselves in breach of the JCPOA. Now, here I will admit to a surreal quality in this entire discussion, because one of the major parties to the JCPOA, in fact, the major party to the JCPOA, apart from Iran, was the United States, and the United States quit the JCPOA back in 2018, at the time when Donald Trump was going through his first term, and the United States at that point imposed draconian sanctions on Iran, which, to my best recollection, went well beyond the sanctions that the Security Council had imposed previously, and which, in accordance with the snapback provisions, are coming back into effect. The Biden administration, which succeeded the Trump administration, campaigned in the presidential election of 2020 on the basis that it would take the United States back into the JCPOA, but of course it never did. There were all sorts of complicated negotiations between the United States and Iran. The Biden administration made demands that Iran agree to rewrite the terms of the JCPOA, basically to restrict Iranian foreign policy in all sorts of ways, but also, as I remember, to limit the development of its ballistic missile program. And of course, Iran refused. So the United States, since 2018, has not been part of the JCPOA. The United States, apparently, under the Biden administration, somewhat softened the sanctions stance previously taken by the Trump administration. I don't think it actually withdrew any of the Trump-era sanctions, but perhaps it enforced them rather more lightly. But anyway, with Donald Trump back in the White House, the earlier sanctions regime is, again, as I understand it, pretty much in effect once more, though the United States has carved out an exemption allowing China to continue to buy oil from Iran. So anyway, that is where we are. The Europeans insist that Iran comply with an agreement from which the other key party, the United States, has withdrawn. I mean, already this looks unbalanced and lopsided. But to add to the trouble, the Iranians say that as far as they are concerned, the European states themselves are also in violation of the JCPOA. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I understand all the details here very well, but the Iranians insist that this is not even controversial. They may be right about that, they may be wrong about that, I don't know. But they say it is not controversial that the Europeans, presumably because they've gone along with the fact that the Americans have withdrawn from the JCPOA and have themselves enforced the American sanctions, are themselves therefore in breach of the JCPOA. And the Iranians are saying that this means that the Europeans are not in any position to say that Iran is in breach of its obligations under the JCPOA and has no right to invoke the sanctions snapback. Now, I am not going to get into the details of whether the Iranian position is legally speaking correct. I doubt that anybody would ever be able to say conclusively, and besides, there's never going to be a legal determination of this point. The point is that the Iranians are saying that what the Europeans did yesterday is illegal, that the Europeans, being themselves in breach of the JCPOA, have no right to say that Iran is. So there we are. Now, we can spend a great deal of time discussing the realities, the legalities of this, but perhaps in more senses than one, it makes almost no sense to waste time doing so. Let's just take a step back and consider what has happened. An agreement was made in 2015, the JCPOA. It is universally accepted that in the 3 years that followed, Iran complied with its obligations under the JCPOA. The United States gave Iran the impression in 2015 that if Iran did comply with the JCPOA, sanctions against Iran would be lifted. In fact, that never fully happened. Even the Obama administration never lifted all of the sanctions that the United States had imposed on Iran. Notwithstanding that, and despite Iran's compliance with the JCPOA, between 2015 and 2018, which is not disputed, the United States in 2018 withdrew from the JCPOA and imposed further sanctions against Iran, completely contrary to the spirit of the JCPOA, subsequently sought to renegotiate the terms of the JCPOA, and was supported in that stance by the Europeans. Then, a few months ago, even as steps started to be made between Iran and the United States to try to negotiate some way back, the Iranians, as we know, did resume nuclear enrichment, and they did go beyond the limit that the JCPOA had imposed. They started to enrich some uranium up to 60%, and I've already expressed my own doubt about the logic of doing that, and my own view that, diplomatically speaking, that might have been a mistake. But anyway, the Iranians and the Americans, nonetheless, after Donald Trump returned to the White House, were back in negotiations with each other. There were what appeared to be a series of successful meetings between the Iranians, between Arakshi, and the Americans, led by Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff. And there were lots of rumors which I discussed in programs on this channel, and which we on the Duran also discussed, that the Russians were playing or were seeking to play some sort of mediation role, and these rumors were in part at least confirmed by the Russians themselves. So that's where we were until June. And then, even as the Americans and the Iranians were about to meet, Israel launched an attack on Iran and attacked not just Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, but also murdered about 20 of Iran's nuclear scientists. I say murdered, killed. Let's say killed 20 of Iran's nuclear scientists, and made a systematic attempt to kill also Iran's top political and military leadership. And as the Iranians, I think, correctly say, it seems as if the Israelis had obtained some of their targeting data from information gleaned by the IAEA and passed on to them presumably by the United States and the other Western powers, and of course the United States, which was in receipt of the information from the IAEA, then itself launched attacks on the Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordow, Natanz and Isfahan, and did so without any serious objection from the IAEA. This is the reality. I don't think what I have said is really factually controversial. A 12-day war followed, in which ultimately the United States and Israel in particular, which was suffering missile strikes by Iran, sought a ceasefire, and there has been a shaky ceasefire ever since in place. Now, given this history, how can one come forward in all seriousness and imply that it is Iran in some respects, in key respects, that is in violation of the JCPOA, so as to cause the snapback of sanctions to come into effect in October? I mean, I say that, no doubt the Iranians by now are in breach of their obligations under the JCPOA. They have enriched uranium above the level set out in the JCPOA. They are preventing the IAEA from examining their facilities. But I don't think anybody could argue, after all that has happened, that they are doing this in the face of extreme provocation. Just saying. Now, put all that aside, what is this even intended to do? What is snapping back the sanctions at this time intended to do? The sanctions that the UN Security Council imposed all those years ago have already been superseded by the much harsher sanctions imposed by the United States. The European powers have been supporting those sanctions. If the UN Security Council sanctions are supposed to be legally back in effect, and the Iranians, by the way, are challenging that, how does that add to the totality of the sanctions that Iran would now be facing? I say this because the two big Eurasian powers, Russia and China, have strongly criticized and rejected this move by the three European powers. They are saying that it was unbelievably, completely unhelpful at this particular time, that it is a provocative escalation at a tense moment in the relationship between Iran and the West, and that it undermines the possibility of further negotiations and further agreements to find some route back towards something like the JCPOA, which would enable peaceful restrictions to be placed on Iran's nuclear enrichment program. So, given that this is the stance that the Chinese and the Russians are taking, and given that Iran is now a BRIC state, I suspect that the Chinese and the Russians are going to accept the Iranian view that the European powers do not have the right to declare Iran in breach of the JCPOA or to insist on this snapback. In which case, there will be arguments about whether the snapback sanctions are legal or not. I'm not going to get into a discussion about whether they are or not. I think, as I said, in this question of international law, there is never going to be a final decision, a final judgment by any party. So I do not believe that China and Russia are going to observe these UN sanctions or consider that these sanctions in effect bind them. I think the Russians and the Chinese, on the contrary, are going to step up their economic cooperation with Iran. I don't think that they're in any mood to do otherwise. Now, the question is then, because I cannot imagine that the Americans and the Europeans don't know about this, that then brings us to this question of why, in that case, has this been done? Why have the European powers made this decision at this particular point in time? Well, there is a technical reason. I understand that if there had not been a snapback in the sanctions by October of this year, the sanctions would have expired and there would be no mechanism at all for bringing them back. So at one level, this does look like a way of preserving the US sanctions weapon against Iran. So I think that plays a very significant part in this. I remember that back in the autumn of last year and the winter, when the talk about attacks on Iran by Israel first started to float around the media, one of the concerns that the Israelis were apparently expressing was that without action by Israel, the sanctions would indeed expire in October of this year, and that would be the end once and for all of UN sanctions, and the Israelis didn't want that to happen. So that probably is one reason. But I think there's a much more important reason, which is that, of course, the Israelis and the hardliners in the Trump administration, which at times, it must be said, have included the president himself, Donald Trump, now have the argument, the excuse they've always sought for an attack on Iran, that Iran is engaging in a nuclear enrichment program, contrary to earlier, older UN Security Council resolutions, and that it is in breach of its obligations, both under the JCPOA and under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And you can see where this is inexorably going to take us. Because given that that excuse is now going to be there, and given that it is going to be talked about incessantly in Israel, in Europe, in the United States, in the think tanks, in the media, in the talk shows, in all of these places, pressure for an attack on Iran is certain to grow. And I cannot myself seriously believe that this decision that was just made was made with any other purpose than to prepare the ground for that situation. The war clouds in the Middle East are gathering. As I discussed in recent program on this channel, and as we discussed in an even more recent program we did on the Duran, last month, the Supreme Leader of Iran's National Security Advisor and Iran's Defense Minister went to Moscow, where they had high-level talks, which included Vladimir Putin himself. President Pezeshkian of Iran is likely to be in Tianjin in a few days, in a few hours maybe, where no doubt he will be meeting with Chinese and Russian leaders. Quite likely he will have meetings there with both Xi Jinping and with Putin himself. The Iranians have organized a new defense council, clearly a war council to prepare Iran and to guide Iran through a renewal of the war. And I've received reports, which I've discussed in earlier programs, that the Iranians are now working in earnest with the Russians finally to develop an air defense system, though it will be many months, perhaps years, before it is fully operational, giving, it must be said, the Israelis and the Americans a window which they can use for an attack. I would add that I've received more recent news, ultimately from Russian sources, about certain steps that the Russians are looking for ways to take, which would this time provide Iran with an early warning of an Israeli and American attack. But looking at these rather complex ideas, which I'm not really in a position either to disclose or to understand very well, I can't help but think it's going to take a while before such a system is in place. I say a while, probably many months, probably not until the latter half of next year. So there is a window for the Israelis and the Americans to launch a renewed attack on Iran. And my own conviction, and it is now hardening into virtual certainty after the actions of the last 24 hours, is that that is now coming. We need to be prepared for a renewed conflict between Israel, probably the United States, and Iran later in the autumn. Now, I'm also going to say I think this time the attack will be stronger. I think the Iranians will be better prepared for the attack when it comes. I don't believe that this conflict is going to last just 12 days. I think this will be a more prolonged conflict, more difficult to end. I think the parties on each side will be more committed to seeing it through, and we'll have to wait and see how it goes and how it ends. But anyway, that's my view of the situation now. Now, let me then now return to the other topic of this program, which is the one that's going to take up the more time. Though I would say, quickly, if we do see a renewal of the fighting between Israel and Iran in the autumn, and if the United States does become involved, the level of crisis will be extreme in the international system, with potential major effects on the global economy. And it will be, frankly, a bigger and even more important crisis than the crisis we're seeing playing out at the moment in Ukraine. But anyway, let me now turn to the situation in Ukraine. Now, there's been a rather good article on responsible statecraft by Ben Armbruster. Diplomacy Watch: is there a next for Ukrainian peace talks? And Ben Armbruster makes the entirely valid point, which is that we had the meeting in Anchorage between Putin and Trump. We had the follow-up meeting, if one can call it that, the meeting a few days later in Washington between Trump and Zelensky, with all the European leaders there hanging around. And, well, what has happened since? Where is the diplomacy that those meetings seem to promise? Donald Trump came out of the meetings appearing to suggest that things was going to start moving quickly, that there was going to be talks between the Americans, the Russians and the Ukrainians. There was be a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and that would result in a trilateral meeting which would involve himself, and there was talk of land swaps and security guarantees and all of that. But anyway, the overall impression was that things were going to start moving very, very fast, There was even talk of a meeting between Zelensky and Putin on the 22nd of August, and actually nothing has happened. There's been no movement in the diplomacy whatsoever. The Ukrainians, as I've discussed in several programs, have refused to budge on anything. They're not prepared to withdraw from any territory. They continue to insist that all territory in post-1991 Ukraine, which the Russians, as they say, occupy, is and will always continue to be Ukrainian. They insist on security guarantees, rights to NATO entry, rights to EU entry. They have shown no indication that they are prepared to compromise on any matter, on the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, on the rights of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. In fact, yesterday, they made a formal legal decision that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the canonical, historic Orthodox Church in Ukraine, is indeed linked to Russia, and the Russia is somehow subordinate to the Orthodox Church in Russia, and many are assuming, I have no doubt correctly, that that is preparatory to having the Orthodox Church, the canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine, finally banned. So there is no sign that the Ukrainians are prepared to give ground on anything at all. And they also continue to resist, or rather ignore, calls from the Russians to set up 3 working parties to continue the Istanbul talks. They reject everything. President Trump has expressed some exasperation about this. He said that he's disappointed by the Ukrainians and by Zelensky. He's even hinted that he might impose sanctions on Ukraine, though I don't think anybody believes or takes that seriously. There are also reports that he has in private expressed resentment and disappointment with the EU leaders as well, which I'm sure is true, but it translates to nothing because he's not made or taken any step concerning that publicly whatsoever. To all visible appearance, he continues to be best friends with all of them, even though the photographs from the Washington meeting say otherwise. We see somber, glowering faces, angry faces on the part of the Europeans, and one gets a strong sense that with Trump as well, his attitude to the Europeans ultimately, deep down, is one of dislike and contempt. But anyway, he's not prepared to break with them in public. Meanwhile, the war continues, and of course the other day the Russians launched their big missile and drone strike against Kiev, the second biggest apparently that they've conducted over the course of the war, the previous biggest one having been in July. And there are lots of reports now that the Europeans in particular were absolutely shocked by the scale of this attack. The European countries and the British called in the Russian ambassadors to protest this strike. The grounds for doing so were the supposed attacks on the British consulate, on the British Council building in Kiev, and the European diplomatic premises in Kiev as well. Now, I should say here that we've had more news, and I want to correct something that I said in my previous video. I said that it seemed as if the Russians had attacked both of these buildings, and that's certainly been the impression given by the media here in London. But then I read, I think it was actually in The Guardian, that in fact it is wrong and that the 2 buildings were not attacked by the Russians at all, that the missiles that were launched were not launched at these 2 buildings, the British Council building and the EU representative office building. They targeted other buildings and other facilities nearby, and though there was damage to these buildings from shrapnel and some ground shaking and all of that, and some of the staff in the EU representative office were apparently and understandably deeply alarmed by what had happened. They were not actually at risk because they were not in fact targeted. Well, that seems to be the case, which does perhaps cast some light over the way in which this story has been covered, and does perhaps raise some questions about this concerted calling in of Russian ambassadors to complain to them. I would say that if missiles land next to an embassy or diplomatic building, I don't know whether the British Council classifies as a diplomatic building, I presume not, but let's act as if it is. If missiles are launched at targets close by and the result is that shrapnel causes damage, then I think that probably is a violation of the Vienna Convention, and it would justify some degree of complaint, but perhaps arguably not in the way that we have seen, on the concerted way that we have seen. I believe that the reason the Europeans and the British called in the ambassadors, and the reason for some of the commentary, is that there is a state of shock about the scale of this assault on Kiev. And I'm going to say something else. I believe that the Europeans and the British were shocked at the total failure, the complete collapse of Kiev's air defense system. I believe that they had persuaded themselves after July that Kiev's air defense system had been upgraded in some way, that there was more success in shooting down the Russian drones. I think they probably believed some of the claims the Ukrainians have been making about their success in shooting down Russian drones and missiles. The Ukrainians, by the way, claimed that they shot down nearly all of the missiles and drones that the Russians launched at Kiev, just saying. The reality, as this attack has now brought home, is that the majority of these drones and missiles get through. And there was little evidence over the course of that strike that the Ukrainian air defense system over Kiev was operating effectively. And I think this has caused a deep shock and growing alarm, especially as there is a sense that Russian missile and airstrikes on Kiev are expanding in power, and you can get some sense of that from the Europeans and the way that they've talked about this story. I suspect that they were also somewhat alarmed or dismayed by the fact that this time Donald Trump, the President of the United States, who has previously criticized Russian missile strikes and drone strikes on Kiev, on this occasion he didn't do so, or at least not to any very significant degree. On the contrary, the White House spokesman said that Trump understood why this attack had happened. So there is shock, there is dismay, but there also is continued discussion and negotiation between the Europeans about how to move forward with the security guarantees for Ukraine that they have been talking about with themselves. Now, there have been two really good articles about this topic, one by Anatol Lieven on Unheard, the British centre-left magazine, and the other by his colleague Mark Episkopos on Responsible Statecraft. Both of them point to the utterly fantastic, indeed genuinely deranged nature of this whole discussion. The Europeans have entirely lacked the military forces to deter the Russians to any significant degree. The talk now is that whatever forces cobbled together, it will be mostly put together from the British and French militaries. Given the extraordinary rundown state of both of those militaries, the total size of the force will probably be somewhere in the region of 10,000 men. This in a conflict where the two armies, the Russian and the Ukrainian, number in the hundreds of thousands. So the idea that such a force can deter the Russians is an absurd one. Mark Episcopos has made the entirely valid point also that the assumption that there appears to be that the Americans are providing some sort of backstop for this force is simply wrong. There is no backstop at all. There is no talk of an American backstop. On the contrary, when one analyzes American words carefully, it becomes very quickly obvious that the United States is determined to avoid any possible situation in which it could find itself in an armed conflict with Russia. So all of the words about help with intelligence and help in the air and all of that fall far short of the backstop that the British and the French, Macron and Starmer, have been demanding. Moreover, everybody agrees that nothing like this can happen unless the Russians agree to this and the war ends, and the Russians are not agreeing to this. In fact, the Russian Foreign Ministry has just made this again absolutely crystal clear. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman said today, security guarantees for Ukraine should be a result, not a condition, of a peaceful settlement. With due account of Russia's interests, one needs to understand that the provision of security guarantees is not a condition but a result of a peaceful resolution through the elimination of the root causes of the crisis in Ukraine. In turn, that will also guarantee security for our country, for Russia. So the Russians are refusing all discussions. They're rejecting all of the current discussions about security guarantees. They've ruled out troop deployments. They've made that position absolutely clear. So what is the basis for having these discussions at all? It is very strange and all very, very difficult to understand. And one gets the sense that the Europeans are busy talking with each other about something which ultimately cannot happen. Now, Stephen Bryan, one of the most capable analysts that I know, and a person who's formerly worked in the Pentagon and who perhaps has still some contacts there, has written a very disturbing Substack blog in which he says that the explanation, the answer for this mystery is that the Americans and the Europeans, far from expecting the Russians to agree to this proposal, are instead intending to impose this on the Russians, to impose the deployment of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine on the Russians by achieving a military victory against them. And this is based on assumptions about Russian losses. It seems that the Europeans and the Americans believe that Russian losses are as great as the Ukrainians are telling them, that the Russian army, therefore, is in a very weak condition, that the Ukrainians, by contrast, are actually in a stronger position, and that the new deliveries of ARAM missiles, which I talked about in one of my recent programs, and of other types of missiles like the Flamingo, taken together, combined with European reserves, and rather with these remaining husbanded Ukrainian reserves and all of that, that they would be sufficient for the Ukrainians to launch some kind of renewed offensive, this time towards Crimea. And the idea is that this would then lead to a defeat of the Russians, and that as part of the terms imposed upon the Russians subsequent to this defeat, the Russians would be obliged to accept a NATO presence in Western Ukraine. That's the outline of what Stephen Bryan is saying. Now, I have to say, I see immediate problems. Firstly, as I will discuss in a moment, this hypothesis about casualties is completely, even preposterously wrong. It gets things completely the wrong way round. Secondly, if we're talking about the Flamingo, this big missile that the Ukrainians have put together and which they are supposedly going to launch against targets deep inside Russia, and about the Iran missile and all of that, I think that these are not going to be game changers, not remotely. The Iran missile, I'm not even sure that the Iran missile, I still am not sure that it even exists, and I suspect that the delivery of this system is still a long way off, as Stephen Bryan himself acknowledges. The United States, the Trump administration, is apparently prohibiting further Ukrainian missile strikes in pre-2014 Russia. So this is not going to be used for an offensive against the Russian deep rear. And of course, the Flamingo probably could in theory be, but it is unlikely to be very successful. And anyway, I have to say that the weapons situation simply doesn't look strong enough, and the state of the Ukrainian army, in my opinion, makes it unable to conduct that kind of offensive, specifically against Crimea. And here perhaps it's worth pointing out that one of the most powerful and so far largely unused Russian military forces across the entire territory of the special military operation, a group of forces, Dnieper, commanded by General Templinsky, anyway is there and is in a position to defend Crimea from any such attacks. So already there is fundamental problems in this whole idea. Secondly, the evidence that some people in Europe and the United States and elsewhere are apparently looking to as proof that the Russian military is no longer in a condition to resist an offensive seems to me not just threadbare, but straightforwardly wishful thinking, and completely divorced from the information that Ukrainian commanders and bloggers and telegram channels and all of those people have been providing. Briefly, it said that the deployment of the 14,000 North Korean troops to Kursk region was a sign of the underlying weakness of the Russian military because of the very severe losses that Russia supposedly has followed, and President Putin's repeated protestations that Russia has no plans to attack any other country in Europe is also supposedly proof of the weakness, the overall weakness of the Russian military. Well, the second is truly bizarre because every day we read in the European media especially about how powerful and mighty the Russian army has become, and how if Ukraine falls, it will undoubtedly advance westwards, so that we have to stop the Russians in Ukraine, because if we don't stop them there, they will advance here. They will come here. So if the Europeans really do think that the Russian army is that weak, and that Putin's protestations, that he has no plans to attack anywhere else in Europe, is a sign of weakness, then they're saying one thing to each other in private and the diametric opposite to the public. Well, of course, they can do that. But to be frank, I don't believe this. And in terms of the North Korean deployments, we now have abundant information, both from North Korea and from Russia itself, that the North Korean deployment to Kursk was offered and even insisted upon by Kim Jong-un, and that it was not actually solicited or sought by Russia. So, just saying. Well, Stephen Bryan, nonetheless, as I said, is an extremely clever man, and he's also somebody who does not say things wildly, and he is well connected. So, I am not going to dismiss this story. I think that there is a possibility that some harebrained plan for a further offensive might indeed be in preparation. I have to say I see no evidence of this on the battlefronts. There's none of the chatter that you would expect to see if such a thing really were being prepared. The kind of chatter I remember before Ukraine's Kharkiv and Kherson offensives in the autumn of 2022, and Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive, and even to some extent the Kursk offensive of the summer of 2024. I've seen none of that chatter this time. So I struggle to believe this story, but I am not going to discount it entirely. As I said, I can imagine that some people are sufficiently detached from reality to believe it. Now, that now leads me to another topic which I've also discussed, or rather touched on, in these programs. And here I'm afraid I am going to have to speak extremely carefully indeed. Now, as many of you will recall, about 10 days ago, there was the publication in Russian media of what was claimed to be a leak of data from the Ukrainian General Staff obtained by various bloggers, and this gave, or purportedly gave, information about the state of Ukrainian casualties, and all sorts of figures appeared, which I'm not going to repeat, which were, however, obviously wrong and clearly fantastic, and that cast doubt upon the authenticity of the leak. Now, I expressed my own opinion at the time that it looked to me as if this operation, this leak, had been arranged by Russian intelligence. Now, I have no actual evidence that this is the case, but I no longer have any doubt about this. I am sure that it was Russian intelligence that published that information. And I'm going to anticipate by saying that this information is indeed, in my opinion, based on an actual leak of actual documents held by the Ukrainian General Staff. I'm going to discuss all that in a moment. I think that the Russians leaked this information, made it public, as part of the ongoing discussions between the Americans and themselves. The various back-channel contacts that have been taking place between the Americans and the Russians, and of course the negotiations, the discussions that took place first between Witkoff and Putin in Moscow, and then between Trump and Putin in Anchorage. Now, for some time now, basically ever since Donald Trump was inaugurated, Russian officials have been publicly expressing frustration that Donald Trump has been repeating what the Russians insist are utterly fantastic, completely wrong figures about casualties in Ukraine. Trump has cited exceptionally high numbers for Russian casualties, which the Russians insist have no basis in reality, and has also from time to time provided numbers for Ukrainian casualties, which Russian officials have also said publicly are much too low. And my own sense, and this is, I'm now talking from deduction, this is inference. My own sense is that the Russian intelligence, arranged for the publication of this material in order to disabuse Trump and the Americans about their misconceptions about casualties, because the Russians were worried that these incorrect numbers, these absurdly incorrect numbers about casualties that they were being given, were causing the Americans and Trump personally to think that the United States and Ukraine were in a much stronger position relative to Russia than they actually are. So, as I said, this is an attempt, this publication was an attempt endorsed by the Russian government, quite possibly by Putin himself, to put this data there out into the public so as to correct the misconceptions that the Americans had about the true situation with casualties in Ukraine. Now, over the last 10 days or so, I've been receiving information, and I'm not going to discuss very much about this information, that these numbers are indeed being reviewed and examined by various parties in the West. I say various parties. And they have been going back through this material, and they have been looking through this material, and they've discovered a number of things. Firstly, that the original figures that were being touted as to the level of casualties, that these figures, this data supposedly showed that those figures, the headline numbers, if you like, that those were wrong. That those are straightforwardly wrong. They gave a completely misleading impression as to the true level of Ukrainian casualties. And if you actually work through the figures, it becomes clear that they are wrong. The figures do, however, once attempts are made to corroborate them, and I'm not going to explain how that has been done. I have some information about this. In fact, it's an extensive amount of information about how this has been done. And I can see that this is probably both an extremely intensive but also fairly foolproof operation. Anyway, This examination of the data has essentially confirmed that the data, the leak, has leaked actual documents, and it is possible to get an accurate picture of Ukrainian casualties from this data. Now, there are errors. I have been told, I have learned that the level of error is within the very low single figure percentages. I also have been given overall numbers for casualties, and I believe these are the most accurate figures about Ukrainian casualties that I have had up to this time. I'm not going to disclose what those numbers are because I strongly suspect that this information by now is classified, and I do not publish classified information. What I will say is that this information is consistent with the deductions I made on the basis of the two samples of a group of Ukrainian soldiers and of a group of Russian soldiers provided to me by a source. That deduction was that 80% of Ukrainian infantry men who joined up in 2022 and thereafter are by now dead, and 80% of Russian infantrymen who joined up in 2022 and at some point after, by contrast, are alive. That was the deduction I drew then. And these numbers that I have seen, which are drawn from this data, appear to be in line with that. To put it perhaps rather more straightforwardly, if you join the Ukrainian army as an infantryman or in some other combat capacity in 2022, when the vast bulk of Ukrainian soldiers in fact did join the army, it was over the course of 2022, as an infantryman at that time, then by now you are probably dead. Probably dead. Not definitely dead, but probably dead. So that gives a sense of the scale of the losses that Ukraine is suffering. And by the way, this does lead to another rather disturbing, rather dark thought, which is that, of course, one of the purposes of the special military operation is to demilitarize Ukraine and to rid Ukraine of the followers of what you might call the ultra-nationalist ideology. Now, Brian Beletic has made the point many times that it is achieving these sort of objectives that is for the Russians the primary priority in the conflict. Capturing the odd town or village is less important than doing that. Well, if we're talking about the very highly motivated people who joined the Ukrainian army in 2022 and who provided, if you like, the electoral and political base of what you might call the ultra-nationalist Maidan movement. Well, if you wanted to find some means to eliminate them physically, then conducting the special military operation in the way that the Russians have been doing perhaps could not be improved on. Now, I don't know that that was the objective, that is any part of the plan. I have to say, if it is, the thought is, as I said, an extremely disturbing one. I should say I don't agree ideologically with these people, but there are humanitarian considerations which must apply to them also, as to every other human being. But anyway, that might be a further implication that might be drawn from those figures. Now, over the last couple of days, President Zelensky and his officials have done a surprising thing, which is that they have lifted the prohibition on emigrating, on leaving Ukraine, not emigrating, leaving Ukraine, of young men aged 18 to 22. And this has surprised many, many people. After the start of the special military operation, it became illegal for men to leave Ukraine. And obviously this is a demographic, the 18 to 22-year-old demographic, that is one that some people in the West in particular have been agitating and demanding that Ukraine call up. Now, there is a practical explanation for why this decision to let these people travel to the West, which is, I presume, where most of them will go, why this decision has been made now. Apparently, the Ukrainian authorities have long since realized that many young men do manage to go to the West, to leave Ukraine. There are all kinds of ways to do so, and many of them, of course, have already done so. Keeping a ban, maintaining a ban in place that prevents them from leaving Ukraine, ensures, guarantees that they will never come back, or at least that they will not come back whilst the war is underway. Because, of course, if they do, they risk being enlisted into the army and they cannot leave. Lifting the ban means that they can leave, but that they can also come back, and there is some hope that that might cause some Ukrainians in the West, some young Ukrainians in the West, to choose to come back. It is also, of course, the case that Western governments have been increasingly unhappy about the large number of Ukrainians in their midst, and in many countries in the West, in Europe, there have been pressures to try to get Ukrainians to return to Ukraine, and it could be that this recent decision was made in part in order to facilitate that process. So there is a practical explanation for this decision, and that's probably the reason for it. I, however, would like to believe, and I appreciate that here many people will say that I am being naive, that Zelensky and his officials, who probably are familiar with some of the data that I've just been discussing, have some understanding of the full horror of what is happening on the battlefronts, and have some awakenings of conscience. And they perhaps understand that young men who leave Ukraine are in fact very unlikely to come back, even now, even if the ban is no longer in place. And I wonder whether at some level, perhaps not even acknowledged, the decision to lift the ban has been made in order to keep these young people out of harm's way. Well, I would like to believe so. There's been very little sign of humanity in this war, certainly not from that side. So perhaps, as I said, I'm being naive or engaging in wishful thinking. But then I always want to believe the best in human nature. And I always want to believe that somewhere in every human soul, there are the pricks of conscience. And anyway, that is what I want to believe is the case in this case. Anyway, to repeat again, and to come back to my main point, if there is some harebrained plan to launch a new offensive it will fail, and it will fail disastrously, and it will accelerate the Ukrainian collapse. It would be a disaster, in fact. It would be a cataclysmic error. And for that reason, I do hope that this information, which, as I said, I believe is authentic, will be circulated and will be taken seriously. We'll see. But as I said, if there is such an attack, it would be a disastrous mistake. But what other explanation is there for this bizarre insistence on coming up with these fantastic, elaborate, absurd plans to come up with, well, now apparently troop deployments, European troop deployments in Western Ukraine, buffer zones to be patrolled by someone, not at all clear who, all of that. What is the reason for all of this? Well, I'm going to make a suggestion that rather than theorize about Ukrainian offensives, the answer might have been provided by a rather interesting article in Reuters, which has flown under the radar. Now, this article is based on information from European officials, and it is describing the interactions they had with Trump and Witkoff prior to the Alaska summit. And it, I think, is up to a certain point reliable. It doesn't pretend this time to be based on information from Russian sources. Firstly, this article says that General Kellogg, was completely blindsided by Witkoff's visit to Moscow and was actually infuriated. He was rendered furious by it because he thought that he had brought Trump to agree to impose massive sanctions on Russia and its trading partners, and suddenly he saw that whole elaborate plan smashed to pieces. And he was apparently very angry. I can believe that, though the article says that he is denying this, and he continues to insist that he and Witkoff are working together as part of the president's loyal team and are apparently the best of friends. Anyway, that's one part of this article. Here I believe the article, by the way, in place of Kellogg's own protestations. Anyway, the article then goes on to say that when Witkoff met Putin, he did not go with a note taker from the State Department. Presumably that means an interpreter. And I suspect that that is true. And by the way, I suspect that that was done on purpose. I suspect that Trump and Witkoff want to conduct diplomacy with Putin directly. They do not want others to see exactly what they and Putin have been saying to each other. There is a very great, deep amount of secrecy about all of this, and a massive lack of trust on the part of Trump and Witkoff of US officials. That, as Professor Mearsheimer has pointed out, is why Trump has appointed Witkoff to this role in the first place. But as a result, there is genuine uncertainty as to what exactly it was that Witkoff and Putin, in fact, said to each other. And Witkoff has given inconsistent accounts at various meetings. So in one meeting, he told the Europeans that Putin had told him that the Russians had agreed to withdraw from Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. And the Europeans were astonished and baffled and couldn't believe this to be true because it was so completely inconsistent with what their own information and Putin's public statements had told them. And then in the next meeting, Witkoff apparently said that what Putin had really been talking about was that he no longer insisted that Russian control of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions be recognized internationally, which is, of course, a very, very different position from any suggestion that he was going to, that Putin spoke about a withdrawal from Zaporozhye or Kherson region. Now, the interesting thing is that nowhere does this Reuters article refer to the other story that has come out, that Putin supposedly offered a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, provided the Ukrainians withdrew from Donbass. I've already pointed out that there is inconsistency here, because why would Putin offer a ceasefire at all when his objective appeared to be to persuade Trump to drop the idea of a ceasefire entirely, which was something that Trump agreed to? So there is no reference to this anywhere in this article. Now that makes me even more sure that Putin never at any time offered any such thing. Maybe Witkoff floated it, maybe the Russians expressed some interest in the idea, but there was never a definite proposal, not by the Russians, probably not by the Americans. There might have been some talk, but nothing was agreed, and nothing was proposed or offered, just to say. So I think that is where it is. Now, the article quotes Kurt Volker, who was a senior US official in Donald Trump's first presidency, with a role in Ukraine, on Ukraine matters, a very, very hardline US official indeed, and a very anti-Russian one, and one who should not be trusted on these matters. But anyway, the Reuters article says that Putin has made no concessions, in fact made no concessions in Anchorage at all, and made no concessions either in his discussions with Witkoff. And I wonder, and I suspect, that in reality this time, Volker is setting it out as it is. Probably the Russians told Witkoff and Trump in Anchorage that if this idea of a ceasefire was taken off the table and if serious negotiations began, then they would indeed be flexible over the course of the negotiations and might look at ideas like a freeze of the conflict in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, and in return for Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass. But I doubt that any concrete or even substantive proposals of that kind were made at all. So that is my view. Of course, I cannot prove this. I wasn't present in the room. I don't know what the facts exactly are. And as Mercouris has also said, and as I've said, I think that in order to cover the retreat, the president's retreat from on the question of a ceasefire, Trump threw the Europeans this idea of security guarantees and troop deployments. He told them that Putin did not object to this. He told the Europeans that Putin was ready for a meeting with Zelensky. He said far more than Putin had ever actually said that he was prepared to agree to or do. But it's set us off with this discussion about security guarantees, troop deployments, and all of those things. I don't think the Russians are paying any attention. And as I said in my program yesterday, I think their primary focus at the moment is to prosecute and win the wall. Now, over the last 24 hours, there's been much more information about the real state of the battle, and I'm not going to discuss it in detail in this program, but the information now increasingly points to the complete failure of the Ukrainian counterattack in the Pokrovsk area. This is the one that took place about a week ago that was supposed to reverse the Russian breakthrough. It seems, this is according to Russian sources, so maybe one should take it with a pinch of salt, but I suspect that this is true. It seems that the Russians are still in possession of some parts of Zoloty Kolodyaz, that they still control, or at least have a presence, in the village of Rubezhnoye, which is located somewhat to the west of Zoloty Kolodyaz, that in fact they still control nearly the entire area of the breakthrough. And yesterday, Raidovka, the Russian magazine based in Smolensk, which has provided us with fairly accurate information about the situation in the Pokrovsk battle, says that the Russians still have a presence to the west of the main road that leads into Rodinsk, and that they still are able to send scouting parties and raiding groups all the way up to Grishin, the village to the north of the E50 road, the road which is, of course, the last remaining supply point for the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk. And I suspect that this information is true, and the Ukrainians, for their part, have now acknowledged Russian control, effectively acknowledged Russian control of many of the positions to the southwest in the southwestern part of Pokrovsk, just south of the E50 road, that the Russians control Kotlino, almost certainly Udachny as well, that they also control the village of Leontovichi essentially within Pokrovsk, and probably other places to the center of Pokrovsk itself. As I said in my program yesterday, it seems to me that the Russians are fighting in the center of Pokrovsk. There is video footage that appears to confirm this, and the Ukrainians have also released more footage which shows the Russians holding positions in the area of the micro-district in southwestern Pokrovsk. So it looks to me as if the Ukrainian situation in Pokrovsk is indeed bad and that it is deteriorating. In fact, there are claims that the Russians are about to bisect Rodinsk, the village to the north of Pokrovsk, that they've cut Ukrainian defenses there in two. And there are also more reports that the Russians have reached the village of Shakhove to the northeast of Pokrovsk, the major fortified village east of the breakthrough area, and that they're in the process of storming that village as well. Now, there's probably an awful lot more going on, and I'm going to return with a more detailed discussion of the situation on the battlefronts in my next program. And there is information from the Liman area especially, where things seem to be going especially badly, and some information also from Western Donbass and Zaporozhye and all of these places. But the point is, the Russian advance continues. It continues relentlessly. The Russians continue to move forward, and their diplomatic position remains strong. American officials, Peter Navarro in particular, have made no secret of their complete exasperation and astonishment at their inability to bend India to their will. They seem to have assumed that India was the weakest link in the BRICS chain, that if they piled on the pressure on India with the tariffs, that would make India bend. On the contrary, as an editorial in the Financial Times has admitted, what these people have managed to do is strengthen the connections between India, Russia, and also cause India to improve its relationship with China. As well as that editorial in the Financial Times, there's a big editorial about this in Global Times, the Chinese newspaper published by the People's Daily, which is itself the official mouthpiece of the Central Committee of China's Communist Party, as an article discussing at length and in great detail the improving relationship between India and China. And of course, Modi is now heading for China. He's gone to Japan first, but then he's going to China. He's going to meet with Xi Jinping. There is some talk, it's touched on in the Financial Times, that India is considering leaving the Quad, which it is supposed to be hosting. This is this group of 4 states, including India, the United States, Australia, and I believe Japan, which was supposed to be confronting China. That India is contemplating that it might want to leave the Quad. We'll see whether that is true. It would be unlike Indian diplomacy to do that. The Indians rarely commit themselves entirely to one course or another, and I suspect that they would say to themselves that if they did leave the Quad, it would burn their bridges with the Americans completely, and they might not want to do that. But they're not going to bend in the face of American pressure, tariff and economic pressure. And Peter Navarro, Trump's advisor, is furious about this. And indeed, he's not just the only official who's angry. One gets the sense that many other American officials are angry and baffled about it as well. Navarro has also expressed his astonishment that India should be thinking of building friendly relations with China. He's brought up the whole topic of the 1962 war between India and China and the territory that China occupies, which is claimed by India, and all of that. Well, there it is. The Americans, I think, underestimated the extent to which the BRIC states are now deeply invested and committed to that project, and also underestimated the fundamental importance for both India and Russia of their relationship with each other. And as for the meetings in China, of course, Putin and Modi will be there. But interestingly, Kim Jong-un is also apparently going, and he will be attending the Victory Day celebrations in China. So we will have an interesting spectacle of Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un all sitting together. 10 years ago, North Korea was an isolated country on bad terms with China, as well as the United States, and with the Russians, now keeping North Korea at a distance. Now, its old allies, China and Russia, are embracing it again. And Kim Jong-un is welcome both in Moscow and Beijing. even as he improves and upgrades his armed forces, his nuclear weapons capabilities, his technologies, and apparently there's increasing talk that the economic conditions in North Korea are improving, and improving significantly as well. When will people in the West understand that pressure, sanctions, tariffs, whether they're applied against North Korea, Iran, Russia, against countries of that kind, not to mention China, India, that far from breaking these countries and bending them to the West's will, the actual effect is always, and without exception, the opposite. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. A lot to think about and see. We'll see how things play out over the next couple of days. I remain of the view that in Ukraine, at least, it is the military situation that is going to decide everything from this point on. And as for the Middle East, war is coming. Well, that's the end of my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.